Most people think darkness is something to escape, something to heal, something to overcome. Carl Jung believed the opposite. He believed darkness appears when something inside you is trying to speak, and the more you ignore it, the louder it becomes. The anxiety you feel at night, the heaviness in your chest, for no clear reason, the sadness that arrives, even when life looks fine. That is not weakness. That is not failure. That is unheard information. Jung warned that what we refuse to face does not disappear. It waits, it watches, and it eventually controls us from behind the scenes. This is why people who avoid darkness often feel the most lost. They chase light without understanding what the dark is asking of them. But darkness is not evil. It is unfinished truth. It is the psyche saying, something essential has been buried, and it will not stay buried forever. From childhood, you were taught to fear darkness, to suppress sadness, to hide anger, to stay positive, to move on quickly. But Jung discovered something unsettling. What you push into the dark does not die. It develops autonomy. It becomes the shadow, and the shadow does not want to destroy you. It wants to be recognized. Darkness enters your life when your conscious identity is no longer sufficient, when the version of you that functions socially can no longer carry the full weight of who you are. That's when symptoms appear: emotional numbness, sudden rage, loss of meaning, chronic exhaustion, repetitive relationship patterns. Jung called these messages from the unconscious, not punishments, not disorders, messages. But most people misinterpret them. They medicate them, distract from them, label them as problems instead of invitations. And because of that, the darkness deepens. Here's the truth most people never hear. Darkness appears when you are ready to evolve. But evolution requires descent. Every myth Jung studied contained the same pattern. The hero does not ascend first. They descend into the cave, into the underworld, into the unknown, because something valuable is hidden there. And the psyche follows the same law. When your life feels dark, it is not because you are broken. It is because your old identity has reached its limit. Jung believed the ego resists this moment more than anything else, because the ego wants stability, familiarity, control. Darkness threatens all three. It dissolves certainty. It removes false confidence. It exposes inner contradictions. And the ego calls that danger, but the self calls it initiation. The darkness wants you to know what you have been avoiding, the grief you never processed, the anger you never expressed, the desires you labeled unacceptable, the strength you were afraid to own. The truth you learned early would cost you love or belonging. So you adapted. You learned to be agreeable, functional, responsible. But adaptation is not integration. And the parts of you that were sacrificed for survival did not disappear. They waited. Jung said the shadow often appears at precisely when a person believes they are finally doing well, because that is when the split becomes unbearable. Outward success, inner emptiness, external stability, internal unrest. This is the moment most people panic. They say, "What's wrong with me?" Jung would say, "Nothing is wrong. Something is ready." The darkness is not asking you to give up your life. It is asking you to reclaim parts of it. But this requires courage, because darkness does not speak in comforting language. It speaks through discomfort, through friction, through emotional intensity. It shows you what you don't want to see before it shows you what you're becoming. Most people turn away here. They go back to distractions, to old roles, to familiar patterns. And the darkness retreats, temporarily, but it always returns, stronger, more insistent, because the psyche does not abandon growth. Jung believed that meaning is not found in happiness, but in confrontation with truth. And truth often wears the face of darkness. If you feel drawn to this message, it's not accidental. Something in you recognizes what's being said. That recognition is not intellectual. It's instinctual. It's the self stirring. And this is where the real work begins. Not by escaping the dark, but by asking it a question most people never ask. What are you trying to show me? About who I really am. The darkness does not arrive empty. It arrives carrying content, memory, emotion, instinct, truth. Carl Jung said the unconscious is not chaotic. It is organized meaning. That consciousness has not yet understood. When darkness enters your life, it is not random suffering. It is stored psychic material, pressing for recognition. Most people imagine darkness as something abstract, but Jung approached it differently. He asked, what exactly lives there? And the answer was unsettling. The darkness contains everything you were forced to abandon in order to belong, not because it was wrong, but because it was inconvenient, too intense, too emotional, too honest, too powerful. From early childhood, you learned what parts of you were welcomed and which were not. If you were rewarded for being calm, your anger went underground. If you were praised for being strong, your vulnerability disappeared into shadow. If you were loved for being useful, your needs became dangerous. Jung said the psyche makes a trade, survival, in exchange for wholeness. And at first, this trade is necessary. A child must adapt, but adaptation becomes a prison when it hardens into identity. Years later, you no longer remember what you sacrificed, but the body remembers. The emotions remember. The unconscious remembers. And darkness is how it speaks. Darkness is the return of what was split off. This is why it feels heavy, because it carries weight that has been ignored for years. Suppressed anger turns into chronic tension. Unexpressed grief turns into numbness. Denied desire turns into restlessness. Unclaimed power turns into anxiety. Jung observed that the shadow often appears first as irritation toward others. You are triggered, judgmental, emotionally reactive, but the reaction is disproportionate. And that is the clue. The darkness shows itself through projection. What you hate most in others is often what you refuse to acknowledge in yourself. Not because you are bad, but because you learned early that embodying that trait was unsafe. So the psyche outsourced it. But the psyche does not delete content. It stores it. And what is stored seeks expression. This is why people who deny darkness often feel controlled by it. Sudden outbursts, compulsions, self-sabotage, addictions, repetitive relationship failures. Jung said, the shadow becomes dangerous only when it is unconscious. When it is seen, it becomes energy, clarity, strength, boundaries. But seeing it requires tolerating discomfort, because the darkness does not flatter the ego. It does not say, you are perfect. It says, you are incomplete. And the ego resists that truth with everything it has. This is why people spiritualize avoidance. They talk about light, love, positivity, but refuse to look at resentment, jealousy, shame, control, fear of abandonment, fear of insignificance. Jung warned that light without shadow is illusion, and illusion eventually collapses. The darkness wants you to know what your conscious identity cannot hold. The anger you were told was unacceptable often contains your boundaries. The sadness you were rushed through contains your values. The envy you feel reveals unclaimed potential. The fear you suppress reveals where your life is misaligned. Darkness is not the opposite of growth. It is the raw material of growth. In alchemy, which Jung studied deeply, darkness was called nigredo, the blackening, the breakdown, the dissolution of old form, not to punish, but to prepare transformation. Nothing new can emerge without something old dissolving. And the psyche follows this same law. When you feel lost, it is often because an old identity is dying and something deeper has not yet been born. This in-between state feels unbearable because the mind wants certainty, but the darkness offers none. It only offers truth. Jung said that depression is often the psyche withdrawing energy from a life that no longer fits, not as cruelty, but as correction. When the soul pulls energy away, it is asking for realignment. But instead of listening, most people panic. They try to return to the old version of themselves, the old goals, the old relationships, the old roles. But the darkness will not allow it, because growth has a direction and regression has a cost. The darkness wants you to know that your symptoms are symbolic. Your anxiety is not random. Your exhaustion is not laziness. Your emotional swings are not weakness. They are messages, encoded in feeling, instead of language. And if you learn to listen, they guide you with precision. But listening requires slowing down, feeling instead of fixing, observing instead of suppressing. Jung believed modern humans suffer, not from too much darkness, but from too little relationship with it. We have lost the ability to sit with inner tension, to remain present with ambiguity, to hold contradiction without collapsing. And so darkness feels overwhelming. But it is not infinite. It is specific, and once named, it loses its power to haunt. This is why shadow work is not about becoming darker. It is about becoming more honest. The darkness wants you to know where you have been living a borrowed life, where you perform instead of express, where you comply instead of choose, where you stay small to avoid conflict, where you remain silent to preserve connection. These choices made sense once, but they are no longer neutral. They are draining you, and the darkness appears to interrupt that drain, not gently, but effectively. Jung said the unconscious always compensates for conscious imbalance. If you live too one-sided, the psyche corrects you. If you identify only with strength, weakness will emerge. If you identify only with kindness, aggression will appear. If you identify only with reason, emotion will break through. This is not pathology. It is balance-seeking intelligence. The darkness wants you to know that wholeness is not purity. It is integration. It is the ability to hold opposing truths without splitting, to be gentle without being weak, to be powerful without being cruel, to be independent without being disconnected. But this requires meeting the parts of you you were taught to reject, not to act them out, but to understand them. Jung never asked people to obey the shadow. He asked them to relate to it, because what you relate to no longer controls you blindly. The darkness wants you to know that your fear of it is based on misunderstanding. It is not chaos. It is unlived life. And unlived life does not disappear. It waits and waits until you are ready to reclaim it. And that readiness is not intellectual. It arrives as discomfort, as restlessness, as a sense that something must change. That feeling is not your enemy. It is your signal, and what you do with it determines whether the darkness becomes your downfall or your initiation. The darkness does not want to be conquered. It wants to be approached with consciousness. Carl Jung was very clear about this. He warned that confronting the unconscious without the right inner posture can be destabilizing, not because the darkness is dangerous, but because resistance is. Most people make one fatal mistake. They rush. They try to fix the darkness, to heal it, to get rid of it. But the unconscious does not respond to force. It responds to relationship. Jung said the psyche changes only when it feels seen, not corrected, not judged, seen. This is why willpower alone never resolves deep inner conflict. You cannot dominate what you refuse to understand. The darkness requires a different kind of strength, the strength to stay present without acting, to feel without collapsing, to observe without defending. This is what Jung called holding the tension of opposites. Most people want relief. The psyche wants integration, and integration takes time. When you first turn toward the darkness, it often intensifies, not because it is getting worse, but because you are no longer numbing yourself. Awareness amplifies sensation, and sensation reveals truth. This is why people panic. When they begin inner work, old emotions surface, memories return, dreams become vivid, reactions sharpen. But Jung said this is a sign The unconscious trusts you enough to reveal its contents, and trust is not given lightly. The darkness wants to know if you can stay, if you can listen, without immediately trying to escape, if you can tolerate ambiguity, because what emerges first is rarely clarity. It is contradiction. You discover that you are both loving and resentful, both generous and controlling, both confident and afraid. The ego wants consistency. The self wants truth. And truth is paradoxical. Jung believed maturity is measured by how much inner tension a person can endure without splitting into extremes. This is why shadow work is not emotional indulgence. It is emotional discipline. You learn to contain feeling instead of acting it out, to name it instead of projecting it, to reflect instead of reacting. The darkness wants you to know that your reactions are symbolic. When someone angers you intensely, it is not just about them. Something inside you is asking to be acknowledged, not expressed blindly, acknowledged consciously. Jung taught that projection is the royal road to the shadow. What you see out there, with emotional charge, is pointing inward. But this does not mean you blame yourself for everything. It means you ask a different question. Instead of, why are they like this? You ask, what part of me is being activated? This single shift changes everything because it returns power to the psyche. The darkness loses its grip when it becomes conscious content. But consciousness is not analysis alone. It is embodied awareness. The body is where the shadow lives. Tightness in the chest, clenched jaw, shallow breath, restless energy. Jung believed the body often reveals the truth before the mind can accept it. This is why staying present with sensation is essential, not to drown in it, but to observe it, to notice patterns, triggers, repeating themes. The darkness speaks in patterns, recurring dreams, recurring conflicts, recurring emotional loops. The psyche repeats until something is learned. This is not punishment. It is persistence. The darkness wants you to know that avoidance keeps you trapped in repetition, but attention breaks the cycle. Even a small amount of awareness, introduced consistently, begins to dissolve compulsion. Jung emphasized patience, not passive patience, active waiting, the ability to sit with inner material without forcing outcome. This is extremely difficult. For modern minds, we are trained to act, to fix, to optimize, but the unconscious operates on a different rhythm. Rushing it creates backlash. Ignoring it creates symptoms. Relationship creates transformation. The darkness also demands humility because it reveals that the ego is not in control. And this realization can feel threatening. But Jung believed true strength begins when the ego accepts its limited authority. You are not meant to control the psyche. You are meant to cooperate with it. This cooperation is what Jung called individuation, the process of becoming whole, not perfect, whole. Individuation does not eliminate conflict. It integrates it. It allows opposing forces to coexist within one personality. And this integration releases enormous energy, energy previously spent on repression, on defense, on self-policing, on maintaining false identity. When the shadow is integrated, you feel more grounded, more real, less reactive, not because life becomes easy, but because you are no longer at war with yourself. The darkness wants you to know that peace is not the absence of struggle. It is the absence of inner division. And division is created when parts of you are disowned. Integration begins the moment you stop labeling parts of yourself as unacceptable and start asking what role they were trying to play. Anger may have been protecting you. Withdrawal may have been preserving you. Control may have been stabilizing you. Even self-sabotage may have been a refusal to live a false life. Jung believed symptoms are meaningful. They arise with intention, and when understood, they no longer need to persist. This does not happen overnight, but it happens reliably when the relationship is maintained. The darkness wants consistency. not intensity. A little awareness, applied daily, changes the psyche more than dramatic breakthroughs. Jung warned against inflation, the ego becoming fascinated with its own depth. True shadow work is quiet, grounded, often invisible to others. But internally, it reorganizes everything. Your values shift, your boundaries strengthen, your relationships clarify, your energy stabilizes. You stop chasing validation because you are no longer abandoning yourself. The darkness wants you to know that integration does not make you darker. It makes you more alive, more present, more authentic, more capable of real intimacy. Because intimacy requires that nothing essential be hidden. And the greatest relief comes when you realize you no longer have to fight yourself to be acceptable. When the darkness is integrated, life does not suddenly become easy, but it becomes honest. And honesty changes everything. Carl Jung believed that most suffering comes not from pain itself, but from resistance to truth. When you stop running from your darkness, you stop leaking energy. The constant inner friction disappears. You feel more solid, more anchored, less desperate for certainty, because you are no longer fragmented. Integration does not mean you lose your edge. It means your power is no longer split. Your instincts become clearer. Your intuition sharpens. Your decisions feel grounded instead of reactive. Jung described this as the emergence of the self, not the ego self, but the deeper organizing center of the psyche. When the self begins to lead, life rearranges naturally. You stop forcing paths that were never aligned. You stop chasing approval that was never satisfying. You stop betraying yourself to maintain comfort. And something remarkable happens. You become selective. Selective with your time. Selective with your energy. Selective with who gets access to your inner world. This is not isolation. It is clarity. The darkness teaches discernment. It shows you where you overgave, where you stayed too long, where you compromised your truth to avoid conflict. Integration strengthens boundaries. Without hardening the heart, you can say no. Without guilt, you can walk away. Without resentment, you can stand alone. Without fear. This is psychological adulthood. Jung believed most people remain psychologically adolescent, driven by unconscious need, seeking external validation to stabilize inner insecurity. But when the shadow is integrated, you no longer need to perform. You no longer need to impress. You no longer need to explain yourself. Your presence becomes enough. And people feel it, not because you dominate, but because you are coherent. Inner coherence is magnetic. It cannot be faked. This is why integrated individuals often attract opportunities without chasing them. Their energy is not scattered. It is concentrated. Jung said the psyche naturally organizes around wholeness. When you align internally, external life follows. Not perfectly, but meaningfully. You begin to recognize patterns before they repeat. You sense when something is misaligned. Before it collapses, you listen to discomfort instead of suppressing it, because discomfort has become information, not threat. The darkness, once feared, becomes an internal guide, a compass, a source of truth. You no longer see emotions as enemies. You see them as signals. You no longer judge yourself for having contradictions. You understand that complexity is a sign of depth. Jung believed that individuation is the highest calling of a human being. Not success, not happiness, but wholeness. And wholeness includes the dark. When the dark is integrated, your creativity deepens. Your relationships become more real. Your work gains meaning because you are no longer operating from fear of exposure. You have already faced yourself, and nothing outside you can threaten that. This is why Jung said, there is no coming to consciousness without pain. But he also said, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Shadow work is not about becoming better. It is about becoming real. And real is powerful. Real does not crumble under pressure. Real adapts. Real endures. Real creates. When you integrate your darkness, You stop seeking identity externally. You stop asking, who should I be? And start asking, what is true for me? That question changes your life. Because truth organizes action, and action grounded in truth creates direction, not confusion, not chaos. Direction. You begin to live forward. Instead of reacting backward, you make choices based on alignment, not avoidance. You no longer fear solitude because you are not empty. You are inhabited. This is what Jung meant by becoming your own authority, not arrogant, not detached, but inwardly anchored. The darkness wants you to know that this state is not reserved for the chosen few. It is available to anyone willing to stop lying to themselves, willing to feel what they avoided, willing to listen without defense, willing to stay when escape is tempting. This path is not dramatic. It is disciplined, quiet, relentless in honesty, but it works every time. If you have made it this far, then something in you already knows. This message is not theoretical. It is personal. It is calling you. And here is the truth. Most people never hear. Insight alone changes nothing. Awareness without action becomes another form of avoidance. Jung warned against this. Understanding the shadow, without integrating it, creates inflation, not transformation. So here is your call to action. Not tomorrow, not someday. Now, tonight, sit in silence for 10 uninterrupted minutes. No phone, no music, no distraction, and ask yourself one question. What part of me have I been refusing to see? Do not answer immediately. Let the body respond. Notice sensations, emotions, images, memories. Write down whatever emerges, without editing. This is not journaling for comfort. This is documentation of truth. Tomorrow, take one concrete action that honors what you discovered. One boundary, one honest conversation, one decision you have been delaying, one behavior you stop tolerating. Shadow work becomes real only when behavior changes. And if this message resonated with you, do not let it dissolve into inspiration. Subscribe. Stay connected. Because this work is not one video. It is a process. And every step deeper reveals more clarity, more strength, and more freedom. You are not broken. You are unfinished. And the darkness is not your enemy. It is the part of you that has been waiting for you to become conscious enough to lead your own life. The moment you stop running, you begin becoming. And that moment can begin right now.